Nick, for the introduction. It's good to be with this group again. I've been here a couple of weeks ago, and it was a joy to see, particularly to participate in the discussion afterwards. Anthony was asking me whether I could present on politics, and then automatically, of course, as a biblical scholar, you think about the prophets. So you cannot discuss politics without prophets. And then he said, well, just do an introduction of 20 minutes or so, and then we can go off in discussions. But really, this is something that is almost impossible to have an introduction to the prophets in 20 minutes. It's like when somebody would ask you as an American citizen, explain me what is the US president. So, and not speaking about Trump, but about the institution of presidency, US presidency. So, and try to summarize it. It's really difficult because you cannot really explain it without explaining, let's say, the Congress, the House of Representatives, to explain elections, to explain voting system, to explain democracy. So to explain actually the founding of the US. So there's a lot of stuff that you have to explain in order to understand what it is to be a US president. And that's the same with prophecy. So whatever I'm going to introduce here in the next couple of minutes will be missing a lot of characteristics, will be missing a lot of important details. So it's kind of a very rough outline of what Old Testament prophecy is and how it relates to politics. So bear with me, and I'm sure I'll trigger some questions that we can then discuss later. Also, feel free to interrupt me if there's something unclear. I would love to be interrupted and clear it out right away if that helps the understanding process. All right, good. So I thought, I start with a verse, kind of a beautiful but also an enigmatic verse that you find in Numbers 11, the fourth book of Moses, Numbers 11, verse 29. And there it says, I'm translating here kind of from my own, you could render the Hebrew in the way by saying, if only all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit on them. So there's this wish expressed in this text that everybody, the world would be ideal if everybody would be a prophet, so to say. So prophecy is obviously a very dominant institution in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, and it needs to be addressed. And I thought we address it best if we contextualize the idea of prophecy in the more larger religious realm. Hans Küng, he has written an important work. I think it's a 1,000-page document publication. Hans Küng, a very important Roman Catholic theologian. And the book is called Global Ethic Project. And there he's trying to define the nature of different religions, and he's trying to find categories that allow you to categorize all religious behaviors that you can find on the globe. And he basically defines 3 different systems. And of course, it's abstraction. Each system has kind of its own subsystems, like Christianity. Christianity has its own subsystems, like Roman Catholicism, then Protestantism, but Protestantism again has its own subsystem, like Lutheran, Calvinist, Evangelical, and so on. Evangelical, they might have their own subsystem and so on. So he's just speaking on these super top level categories, and he says one system is wisdom religions. These are wisdom religions that you find predominantly in China. So they assume that there's a deep connection in the cosmos. And if you observe the cosmos, if you study the cosmos, you see these connections, you see these rhythms, you see these rules that rule the cosmos. And so you should not fight them. You should observe them. You should understand them. And then you should live with them. So that's kind of the wisdom religion. Then we have the internalization religions. Those you find more, for example, in Hinduism, in the Indian religions. They're really the concentration is on the inner self. It's who you are. Don't get confused by all the business around in the environment. Don't get confused by media and social media and so on. Find yourself. So meditate. So the idea of mindfulness comes from this from this internalization religions. And when you find yourself, when you find your inner core, you actually realize that that inner core doesn't belong to you. You don't own it. It belongs to the world, and so you should integrate yourself into the world. So that's kind of the internalization religion. And then you have prophetic religions, and the prophetic religions are Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam. They are prophetic religions. And interestingly, you don't have any religion that is prophetic and not monotheistic. So prophetic religions always come with monotheism, and monotheism requires prophecy. So these are kind of the three different religions. Now, this is very phenomenological in the description. So really wisdom religion focusing on wisdom mainly is not negative at all. In fact, the monotheistic religions also have wisdom traditions. So, or the internalization religions where you focus on the self, these elements you find also in monotheistic religions. So it's not one versus the other, but the question is, what is the most dominant feature? And in biblical religion, in Christianity and Judaism, the prophetic aspect is the most essential one. So after having clarified that, let's discuss what are the characteristics of, well, let's first perhaps discuss, can we see this claim that prophecy is the most essential represented in the Bible? Yes. If you think about the Hebrew way, how the Old Testament is organized, the so-called Tenach, T-N-K, T stands for Torah, N for Nevi'im, that's the prophets, and K for Ketuvim. If you look at that, it's clear the Nevi'im, the prophets, are not covering just the prophetic books that you find from in your Christian Bible, like Isaiah and Jeremiah or Amos and these prophetic books. No, they also include the so-called former books, which would be Joshua all the way to 2nd King. So Joshua all the way down to Malachi, this is one book. It's called the Nevi'im, the prophets. So it's a major bulk of the entire Old Testament, more than half of the Old Testament, which is called prophetic. Now, Joshua till 2nd Kings are called prophetic because obviously prophets appear there, Elijah, Elisha, and so on, Nathan. But it's particularly called prophetic or belonging to the prophets because they report prophetic interpretation of history. So what actually took place, and we can go more into detail later on that. So you have Joshua till the 12th prophetic book, ending with Malachi being the prophets. But then Torah, of course, written by Moses, that is Moses regarded to be the biggest prophet of all. So we have now also Torah. So we have Torah and the Nevi'im, who are prophets, prophetic books. And then Ketuvim, the Ketuvim are the writings, where you find the Psalms is the biggest book. Well, Psalms is also considered in the Jewish tradition to be prophetic because David is regarded as a prophet. And then, of course, you have Daniel, who's also in the Ketuvim, in the writings, also regarded to be a prophet. So we have 28 books in the Old Testament who are prophetic out of 39. 28 out of 39 are prophetic. So this shows you the centrality of prophecy in the Judeo-Christian context. If you think about Jesus, if you move to the New Testament, the one person Jesus speaks about most is John the Baptist, who is introduced, understood, and also displayed as a prophet. So again, also the New Testament is very strong on this assumption that the New Testament message is triggered, is enabled, is made possible through prophecy. Okay, good. Now, when we look at the characteristics of prophets or the prophetic institution, you could say prophetic religions are always confrontational religions in contrast to the wisdom religions and the internalization religions. So they confront you with another, which is typically God. So prophetic religions are not meditative or wisdom searching. They do recognize these categories as important categories, wisdom and meditation. but they recognize as the most important contribution to the religious experience the confrontation by God. And that confrontation is not, most of the time, not pleasant. It creates contradictions. You can make a word game. I think it works also in English. When you have this word encounter, it's always a counter. It's always an opposition that you experience in the encounter. And that's very much the prophetic experience. There is some sort of confrontation that is uncomfortable. Think of Isaiah, think of Jeremiah, or think about the people when they listen to the prophetic words. They are usually confronted really in a way that does not trigger agreement in them, but rather aggression. They don't make the society look good, those prophets. The prophets, therefore, do not represent an ideal of harmony. So prophets are usually not very harmony-seeking people. You can see that in their language as well. Their language is quite, I think, off-putting. That's how you say it in English. It's very aggressive language. It's clear. It's usually short language. It's very concise. It's brusque. It's brutal. So their mean of confrontation is very uncomfortable, and it's verbal. So I think that's an important part for later discussion. So their main mean of confrontation is verbal. Their aggression is verbal. So another important part of the prophetic institution, another characteristic besides it being an encounter or a confrontation, is it's obviously theocentric. So prophecy is not possible without God communicating. It's historical. So the prophets, most prophets in the Old Testament assume that God has revealed himself already. So they rely on past revelations of God. So most decisive things have already happened from the prophetic perspective. And finally, as a third or fourth characteristic, you could say the prophetic religions, they assume a merciful, graceful God, because God has a will to communicate. We are obviously important to him. That in itself means that God is gracious, because if he wants to communicate, it means that you are important to him, even if you have many faults and weaknesses. He does not want to stop speaking to you. So these are kind of some crucial characteristics of the prophetic religion and prophetic culture. Okay, so before moving more into how prophecy relates to politics, let's just warm ourselves up by discussing the terms that are used in order to describe a prophet. So you have two terms. You have a Greek term and you have a Hebrew term. The Greek term is prophetes, that's what we use in English, prophetes. It consists out of two elements. It's a compound word. So pro, you all know the preposition pro, because we use it also in English. Proverbial, or I'm pro this or pro that. And pro can have, the preposition can have two meanings. It can mean before in a temporal sense, predicting. So here, prophetes, if you take it in the preposition in a temporal sense, it would basically mean the predictor, prophetes. But pro can also be preposition with a meaning for or on behalf of. In that case, if you would read it that way, prophetes would mean intercessor. So you have two options, either prophetes meaning predictor or prophetes meaning intercessor. Now, obviously, in the Christian church tradition, prophetes was usually interpreted as a predictor. And I would say that this is quite unfortunate. I think the main meaning of prophetes is actually intercessor, not predictor. The church has usually interpreted pro, this preposition in a temporal sense, for the following reasons. It wants to see the Old Testament as the predictor of the New Testament. So it wants to see the prophets foremostly as the forespellers, the predictors of the Messiah to come. So you have the New Testament as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. That's a dominant focus of the Christian tradition. And it seems that everything else is sacrificed under this prediction element, and therefore the prophet is always foreteller. That this is that this is not so obvious is clear, or becomes clear in the New Testament. Nobody really understands that Jesus is the Messiah predicted by the Old Testament, even the ones who know the Old Testament very, very well. I mean, even after Jesus has been resurrected, think about the disciples of Emmaus. Jesus still had to explain them everything. So it did not automatically and intuitively grow out of your reading of the Old Testament that Jesus is the Messiah. This is a discussion in itself, of course. But the Christian tradition has tried to find everywhere in the Old Testament these predictions. Think about, for example, in Isaiah 7:14, where I think English translations translate something with like, and a virgin will become pregnant. So, and it's taken as a prophecy for Mary, who becomes pregnant with Jesus. Well, the text itself is nowhere in Judaism read as virgin, because the text, the noun that is used there, alma in Hebrew, is actually just meaning a young lady. So a young lady will become pregnant. Yeah, there are some aspects where it could trigger virgin, but the main meaning is just a young lady, and it can be a married young lady. So you see here also that the Christian tradition tries to force a certain interpretation into texts that are a little bit more open than just being read as a predictive prophecy. Or think about Job 19, verse 25, where it says, I know that my Redeemer liveth. I think that's how the King James translates. So Redeemers in the Christian tradition are already a technical term for Jesus, but in the Hebrew language, the word that is used there, goel, is basically just the advocate within the family who takes care of you if you're in a difficult situation. Well, so I guess my point is, from the Christian perspective, prophetes was understood as a predictor for the reasons I provided. Now, if you look at it from a different perspective, namely pro standing for intercessor, the intercessor, it would make much more sense, because most of the work that the prophets do doesn't have anything to do with predictions. In fact, their predictions are of low quality, if you want to say it that way. Low quality, I mean, they are not very precise when it comes to location and time when something is supposed to happen. Yes, they do predict. Jeremiah says the Babylonians are coming. Isaiah says the Assyrians are coming, but when and where, that's not defined. Therefore, you cannot, let's say, trust their predictions when you want to make decisions on the stock market. So that they're not really usable for these types of economic benefits. In other cultures, you have prophets, they make very precise predictions, prophets as predictors. They make precision so that you can make certain decisions with regard to war or economy and so on. That's not possible with biblical prophets. So Navi is the Hebrew term. Navi means basically public callers. They speak publicly, which is also an important characteristic of biblical prophecy. They don't do oracles, secret words, or predictions in a private environment. They're always public. They speak public. You find them at the temple gate or at the city gate or at the palace. They speak public. Everybody can hear them. They are not esoteric. So in addition to that, the Navi, the prophet, is very independent. So they have usually their own economic stability. Elijah, he does not need your food. He does not need your apartment. He does not need your car to go shopping. When he has to go from A to B, he's running as fast as horses run. He doesn't need the horses of the king. If he needs a roof over his head, well, that's his sky, and food is given to him by the birds. So this is kind of a prototypical description of what prophets are. Amos, for example, he doesn't need your money. He's a quite wealthy farmer himself. He's independent, and because they are independent, they don't need your approval, nor the approval of an institution. They don't need to get any permission. They are not like clairvoyants, which usually speak private. They speak public, and they are having no alliance to anybody except to God. Okay. Let me see what I could say in addition to that. Yeah, I think that's enough for now. Let's in the last 5 minutes. Let me get now to prophecy and politics. So when did prophecy come into existence? Well, it's awkwardly at the same time when the monarchy came to existence. So it's about 1100 before Christ with David, Saul, and David. Prophecy came into being. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I think we need to understand that system of monarchy a little bit better in order to understand prophecy better. So monarchy is obviously an institution of power that directs the public destinies. And as the counterpart, prophecy is also an institution, a public institution that has a public force. In the ancient East, kings represent entire empires and people. The kings, they produce the law. The kings, they are the laws, so to say. The entire ancient Eastern world only knows monarchy as the only form of rule. So to be a king or a kingdom feels natural. There's no alternative. This is the only way how to organize human societies. It's the will of the gods. And also in the ancient Eastern world, you don't have a separation like we have it in modern states between jurisdiction, executive, and legislative. You don't have these three different power sources that calibrate each other. No, the king is all of them. Think about the Codex Hammurabi, the rule of Hammurabi. It's really the king who is the judge, the legislator, and the executor. So against a king, you cannot have no right. You don't have any right against the king, because the right is always the king. The rights are with the king. The king is right. So there's something hugely absolutist in this system. There's also no separation of religion and state. All temples are always part of the king's palaces. Even when Solomon builds the temple, it's part of the greater area of his own palace. There's only one alternative, and that's quite striking also for historians, namely what I would call the Exodus experiment. So there has been a time, and you can testify that also archaeologically, there has been a time where there was no monarchy in Israel, where there was a people group living in the Judean and Galilean mountains that did not have a king. And I call this the Exodus experiment. They acted according to the law of God. At least that's what they tried to do. But there was no executive. There was no police checking whether you keep the Sabbath or not. So you were directly responsible to God. This Exodus experiment can be very well understood out of the experience of pharaonic, pharaonic oppression. So basically they say, we live by the rules of a God who has redeemed us from the rules of a pharaoh. These people have escaped the king, and so they are disillusioned about kingship. So now the question is, how all of a sudden do the kings reappear in this Judean, Galilean mountainous area? How does the pharaonic element that they fled from suddenly reappear? Now, this has to be understood from the general political situation that they found themselves. So the Philistines, they invaded Canaan. The Philistines are usually understood to be Greeks coming from the Aegean Islands. They had the iron monopoly. They had a professional army. They had city groups. They were very well organized, and they invaded regularly the farmlands of the Israelites to get the harvest in. And so they needed to push back the Philistines, but you cannot do that without an organization. And that's how kingship came into being. So it was not wanted. It was not done by conviction. Think about the voices of Samuel, but it was a compromise in real politics. So with kingship then, with Saul, David, and so on, the first kings, automatically the prophetic phenomenon appeared. Think about Nathan. So the prophets were always the critical counterforce, because at the moment where kings come to existence, whether it's Saul or David, even the first kings, they start getting pharaonic character traits. Think about David. He starts wars of aggression, not holy wars, wars of aggression. Or think about his what he did with Bathsheba and her husband. So these are pharaonic traits. And so Nathan, the prophets reappear. The prophets preserve the memory of the Exodus ethic. So they critique this absolutist and excessive use of power. The prophets do have an effect for one way or another. They only appear with verbal commitments. They don't become physical. Their power is the word. But somehow they have been able to influence legislation as well as the general society. And I would like to draw your attention here to Deuteronomy 17. Perhaps you can look it up in your Bible. Deuteronomy 17, there are verses 14 till 20. It's the so-called law of the king. And this is not the law being authored by the king, it's the law being authored by God on the king. And that's revolutionary in the ancient Eastern world. So as I said, in the ancient Eastern world, the king is the law. The king writes, the king is the author of the law. There is no law beyond the king. But in Israel, this is different. And that's due to the prophetic commitment. In Israel, the law, the king is always under the law. This is a revolution. The king is not the law. The author of the law is God, and the king is under the law. That means it empowers people to critique, and empowers the prophets, obviously, to critique the king when the king does not abide by these laws. So let me just read a couple of verses here out of Deuteronomy 17. It says, when you set a king over you, that's verse 14, you can do that. That's not a problem, it says in verse 15. But you cannot set a foreigner over you. It must be your brother. And then verse 16, it says, only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt. Not many horses. Or verse 17, he is not allowed to have many wives, which is a symbol for power and political alliances with other nations. Thus, he has to restrict his power. Then it says that he has to copy the book of the law. You see, he's under the law. He has to copy it. He's not authoring the law. He is copying the law. And he, in verse 19, he shall read and meditate it day in and day out so that he can keep the law. So also the king is a lawful figure. Okay, good. So final thing, and then we can go into the discussion. There are prophetic schools being established by the prophets. And I think that's, as an institutional, as an educational institution here at Andrews, paramount to understand. Prophets, they found schools. And in those schools, you find particularly in 2 Kings chapter 2, also 1 Kings 18, these references to those schools. There were schools in Ramah, in Gilgal, in Jericho, in Bethel. These are the power centers, the economic centers of Israel. There you also have schools. And the prophets teach students. Those students don't become predictors, but they become intercessors. So if you're a student of in the prophetic school and you graduate, you will learn. Ellen White is actually quite explicit about what happened in these schools. She said they learned all a trade so that they can become economically independent. Remember, prophets were so sharp in their critique because they didn't have to please anybody. They were independent, also economically. So students of the prophets are economically independent, and they are taught the Exodus ethics. So they become political counter voice in society, and that's why they're also not liked. Ahab tries to kill all of them. Obadiah, he needs to hide many of those students because they are kind of the conscience of a society that is oppressed by the absolutism of power, in that case, monarchy. I think I'll leave it with this. Again, this was just an introduction. Usually I like to work with text, with concrete texts, but it's more, for this discussion, I think better to just have a general introduction to what prophets are. By that, I have tried my best. Please shoot at me and shoot some questions and try to clarify what has been unclear.